Well, I want to thank you for tuning in to our summer Bible teaching series for summer 2022 at MBC. We trust that these series will be an encouragement to you in your faith as you walk with Jesus and as you are better equipped to walk with others along their faith journey. We also want to remind you that at MBC, we are a year-round facility, and we have a series of opportunities for you to engage in keeping with our mission of growing resilient, biblically rooted families. So make sure you check out our website at muskokabible.com to get all the information. We'd love to see you up here this fall and winter.
Good morning. Last week, we spent time looking through the book of Micah, and it ends on a glorious note of God's pardoning grace, and who is a pardoning God like you? And this week we want to look at that, but in the context of church history and the way in which God met his people in a particular period of time in terms of revival. As I'm kind of introducing what we're going to be looking at, you can turn in your Bibles to the book of Psalms, and in some ways this will be the kind of theme verse of what we're looking at this week. Psalm 85 and verses 1 to 5. Psalm 85 and verses 1 through 5. So today I'm going to think with you about the need of God's people for renewal or revival or awakening. And I'm using those terms synonymously. And then tomorrow, Lord willing, we want to think about the way in which revival is linked to prayer. I don't think this can be demonstrated with complete 100% accuracy, but I think one can affirm that whenever there has been periods of remarkable awakening or remarkable renewal or revival, it has been preceded by the prayers of God's people. God stirs his people up to pray for what he promises to do. And so that'll be tomorrow, thinking about our need, if we are serious about seeing our local churches awakened, renewed, and even more on a more broader scale, we need to be a people committed to prayer, particularly corporate prayer. And then on Wednesday, we want to think about the relationship between revival and worship, and how periods of revival are periods of great outpouring of hymnody. And because the period I'm going to be looking at is in the 18th century, we're going to be focusing on hymns in the 18th century. I'm going to be focusing on one person in particular. You might think of people who come to mind, Isaac Watts, the so-called father of English hymnody, or Charles Wesley. J.I. Packer once described him, I think rightly, as the supreme poet of love to Jesus in a revival context. Or you might think of Philip Doddridge or John Newton, Amazing Grace, which probably, if you did a kind of top 10 hymns in North America, Amazing Grace would top the charts. It's interesting, it wouldn't in England, where it was written. For some reason, it's taken off here, but it's not as well sung in England. Or you might think of William Cowper, John Newton's close friend. But we'll be looking at a woman who is the most represented hymn writer of the 18th century, Anne Steele. And maybe you want to kind of look up her name before we look at her on Wednesday. And I want to think with you the way in which hymns are used by God to revive his people, the way in which hymns are critical in terms of teaching about God, and why it's very, very important that we take care what we sing in public. And then Thursday, we want to think about the way in which revival is linked to theology. Maybe for some of you, theology is not a word that regularly comes to your mind. But whenever the Spirit of truth comes to revive his people, he comes to revive truth. Revival and times of renewal are always times of theological reflection and theological reformation. Probably the period of time that you think of most significantly when it comes to Reformation is the Reformation. But the Reformation is a time of revival. And if we have opportunity in the week, I might touch on that. But revival is always a time in which God's Spirit, who is a Spirit of truth, takes his people back to the Word, and they see that maybe they've gotten some things wrong. And we'll actually see one major thing that had been gotten wrong in the 18th century. And then on Friday, we want to think about the way in which revival has fruit. I probably need another week for this. I don't have another week. I was here last week. I wasn't expected to be here this week, so I don't have 2 weeks to think about the fruit of revival. One area that we touched on Monday evening last week was the whole area of racism. And that word that for some have become a bit of a nasty word, social justice. But whenever revival takes place, there is an impact on society. I think one of the ways in which you might think, so are churches today experiencing revival? Well, how are we impacting society? How is society being changed by Christian witness? And revival always is never restricted to the four walls of a church building. It has an impact upon culture, an impact upon society. And if we had time, we would have looked at that on Friday. And the big impact on society in the 18th century was the great ethical question of the 18th century, at least for English-speaking people. Is it right to hold men and women in slavery? Is it right and just to have Africans in bondage? And that was the great ethical question of the 18th century. And that question was resolved with the answer no, because of the revival, because of evangelicals. But we're actually going to think about another fruit of revival, and that is mission. Whenever there is revival, there is a concern for the lost. And God begins to save. He begins to raise up men and women passionate about winning the lost. And the revival that we're going to look at is actually the beginning of what we call the modern missionary movement. In the 18th century, biblical Christianity was located in 2 or 3 places in the world. Western Europe, the American seaboard running from Nova Scotia down to Georgia. Florida was owned for a period of time by the Spanish and was not part of the original United States. The English actually owned Florida for a period of time around the time of the American Revolution, and we gave it up, and we should have kept it, right? And we would have had that great playground in the South to go to, but we gave it up. Anyway, and that's about it. And there were some small areas of settlement on South Africa. Australia had yet to be discovered. 1788 was when Australia, so-called, was discovered. But in the last 250 years, 240 years, Christianity has gone global, or as you might, if you want to use internet terms, it's gone viral. I'm not sure I want to use that term. That's not the word I would like to use, but it's gone global. So much so that the majority of Christians today are not in the West. And in some ways, the great hope for the West, failing revival, are African churches and Koreans and Spanish-speaking churches and so on. And it'll be them who will be sending missionaries to this part of the world if God does not grant us revival. Well, that's the week in a nutshell. So Psalm 85. Lord, you are favorable to your land. You restored the fortunes of Jacob. You forgave the iniquity of your people. You pardoned all their sin. You withdrew all your wrath. You turned from your hot anger. Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation towards us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, so that your people may rejoice in you? Well, to kind of flesh out this theme of revival this week, I want to think about one particular community, one particular group of men and women. And it's a group of men and women I've spent now, probably the best part of 35 years thinking about. So that's a significant period of time. I can still remember when I first read one of the people I'm going to talk about this week, Andrew Fuller. I've got some books on the back table left from last week. I hope to have some others that relate to the theme of what I'm thinking about today. But I remember picking up a book of this man, Andrew Fuller, who I suspect is probably not well known to most of you. I hope you've heard the name John Wesley and Charles Wesley, but Andrew Fuller, who is he? Well, John Piper, about 15 years ago, you've heard the name of John Piper, I suspect, said that probably in the next 100 years, Andrew Fuller's name will be as famous as that of the Wesley brothers or others who are much better known in church history, because he stands at the fountainhead of this modern missionary movement. It was his bringing theological reformation to this group of men and women who are Baptists that initiates the modern missionary movement that we associate with William Carey. So if you're not a Baptist, you'll forgive me. And this is not meant to be a week of immersion, pun intended, in the Baptist world. So you're all going away, those of you who are not Baptists go away thinking, man, I got to become a Baptist. I'm not making some apologetic for the Baptists. What I'm using them is I'm using them as a test case. What does God do when he renews a community? What happens? And the long-term goal of the week is to make you hungry for the presence of God in revival. I'm sure some of you have, and I hope all of you have been in contexts where the theological reality of the omnipresence of God is everywhere, God is here, has been palpably drawn home to you. You've come into a service and for some reason your mind has been focused solely and totally on God. There's just been a sense that God is there. And that's what I hope the week will produce. That a longing for that, a praying for that, and a desire to see God again renew his people. So I'm going to be thinking about a group of people known as the Baptists, and I'm going to give you a little potted history. I've got a number of these through the week. On Wednesday, you're going to get a potted history. That is a little kind of short little focus on the substantial or most important things of hymn singing from roughly the late Middle Ages to the 18th century. So today you're going to get a potted history of Baptists down to the period of the 18th century. I want to do two things today. I want to think about the Baptists as a community in England, and then I want to think about England. And in the 18th century. In the 18th century, maybe you took a course in university on the 18th century history. You might have been, probably what comes to mind is the age of reason, right? But the 18th century is also the age of revival. Or you might be like me. I'm a Jane Austen fan. I have friends who've told me in the years gone by, don't tell people that, Those are quote-unquote chick flicks, and you shouldn't be promoting, men watching chick flicks. Well, I love Jane Austen. I love her novels. I've read all of her novels. And her movies. One just came out, a new BBC version of Persuasion. It's not as good as the old one with Ciarán Hinds. But some of you may know Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth made such a big splash when it came out. It's kind of a it's the kind of gold standard of Jane Austen films. Well, it's that world. That's the 18th century, the world of Jane Austen. And you might think, you look around you in contemporary society and you think, like, could things get any worse? And the 18th century was pretty wicked. And I don't mean wicked there as a good term, right? Wicked, I mean, then that's wicked. It's funny, the English language, right? So if something is really excites you, man, that's cool. At least that's the way, I'm 60s, right? I grew up in the 60s. I don't use words like groovy anymore. I don't think I ever used that word. But, something's cool. But what you mean by that, it's really exciting and, so I'm not using wicked that way. I'm using wicked the way we normally use wicked. It's despicable. So much so that in the 19th century, the people we call the Victorians, when they looked at their grandparents, this is horrifying. When they looked at their grandparents, they were horrified by their lives. And they didn't want to write their biographies. Usually we think, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, they're solid, upstanding citizens, and things have declined since then. But in the 18th century, man, you didn't want anything to do with your grandparents and great-grandparents. But we'll look at that. Let's talk a little bit then about the Baptists. Everybody who goes to a Baptist church today, in an English-speaking Baptist church, has their roots go back to the 17th century. They go back to a group of people who are the children of the Puritans. I trust you've heard the Puritans. My suspicion is the word Puritan is probably not high on your agenda, the word itself. So if I said to you, I think you're kind of puritanical, you would not take that as a compliment. But the Puritans were those men and women in the Church of England. The Church of England was established at the time of the Reformation. It broke with the Church of Rome. And the Puritans came along and they wanted to reform the church according to Scripture. There's a lot more that could be said here. They're a reform movement. They're a renewal movement. And for 100 years, they battled within the Church of England from the 1560s to the 1660s, and they failed. And they were basically booted out. And there is a day of infamy. When I say that word, I think of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's words about December the 7th, 1941, which I don't remember. I'm not that old. But some of you may remember a day that he said would go down in infamy, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But August the 24th, 1662 was such a day as well, when 2,000 Puritan ministers out of 8,000 ministers in the Church of England walked out of their churches because it was illegal for them to continue worshiping and preaching and teaching and leading worship the way they had done. The English state had basically made it impossible for them to continue their ministries. And this would have a dire effect, as we will see. And some of those men and women who went out of the Church of England became Baptists. And Baptists have their roots in Puritanism, and in turn in the Church of England, Anglicanism. Baptists do not have their roots in the Mennonites. Some of you know about the Mennonites. or the Amish, or out west, the Hutterites. Their roots go back further. They go back to the Reformation. They have different kind of origins. There are similarities, but they're not the same. In the roots of Baptists are different. The roots of Baptists go back to the Puritan movement. During the 17th century, the Baptists, and let me give you some statistics. Statistics are helpful. They don't tell you everything. By 1644, there are only seven Baptist churches of the community I'm thinking about in London. By 1660, there are 130 of them. You think about that. From 7 to 130. And if any of you have done a course in English church history, you'll know that 1640s, 1650s is the period of civil war. It's the period of that man whom my grandparents, I'm Irish background, couldn't stand, Oliver Cromwell. And you mention Oliver Cromwell's name in Ireland, and it's a red flag to a bull, as it were. And he was a Puritan, remarkable man in many, many ways. In fact, I did, from my standpoint of my grandparents, they didn't know about this. I wrote a little book on Oliver Cromwell. They would have been absolutely horrified. I mean, I had a dear granny praying that I would become a priest in the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, I ended up writing a book about Oliver Cromwell, who was just a nasty, nasty man, according to the Irish. But that's another story. You know, there's a lot of stories. We have to stay on target. So the Puritans then kicked out of the Church of England, but they flourished between the 1640s, 1650s in a time of civil war. So monumentous was that civil war that the Puritans, not all of them, but some of them, chopped off the head of their king, Charles I, and declared England a republic. The English-speaking people will have another go at the republic again, right? In the 18th century, when they decided we don't want the king, George III. Americans had a king, right? If you're American here today, you once had a king, George III. And you decided in 1775, we don't want him, and you kicked him out, and you became Republicans. Well, the English had done that once before in the 1640s. And that time, they didn't simply kick him out, they chopped his head off publicly. And that was on January the 30th, 1649. And for about 10 years, the Puritans ruled England as a republic. And then the monarchy came back, and the Puritans would be kicked out of the Church of England. But in the middle of that war, the Baptists flourished. It's amazing. I don't know anybody who's done a study. How did they grow from 7 churches to 130 churches in 16 years? Some of these churches were 1,000 people. We're going to talk about one of these men, John Bunyan, in a second. Some of these churches saw 1,000 people gather on a Sunday morning. These aren't small little churches, all of them. And so it's a time initially of Baptist flourishing. Let me talk a little bit about John Bunyan. If I were to ask you, name 3 famous Baptists in the history of the church. Oh, John Bunyan, that's 1. William Carey, that's 2. And we'll talk a little bit about Carey this week. And Charles Spurgeon, pastor of the largest church in the world, 14,000 members. Mega churches, you know, some people complain about mega churches. Well, we've had mega churches on numbers of occasions. We won't be talking about this, but the Reformation is a time of revival. One of the great works of God in the Reformation was in a place called France. And French evangelicals had a church just outside Paris at a place called Charenton. 14 to 15,000 members. Absolutely incredible. But that's another story, right? And one of my hidden goals maybe of this week is to excite you about church history. Some of you may have taken history in high school and or history in university. It was Boersville. And I'm sorry about that, really sorry about that, because after the Bible, the most important thing in your knowledge field should be history. Should be what God has done in the history of his people. It was the great Welsh preacher, Martin Lloyd Jones, of this past century, who sometimes on a Sunday evening, it's hard to imagine this. He was a man who held congregations of 2,000 people regularly in the heart of London. The church was Westminster Chapel, right behind Buckingham Palace, where nobody lives. It's all office blocks, if there's anything. And then there's that huge, thing we call the huge pile that we call Buckingham Palace. Nobody lives down there. 2,000 people. And he said, sometimes I'll go home on a Sunday night. I'm depressed. It's hard to imagine, but he would say that. And he said, what would I do? I would go to the 18th century. He'd go back and read what God had done. And so I hope this week, if you've come here and you think, man, alive, got to listen to 5 mornings of church history. Can't imagine anything. I came here for the Bible. Well, you'll see the Bible fleshed out, I hope, this week. But I think also, I hope you'll see, maybe I should buy a biography in the bookstore of somebody like John Newton or William Wilberforce and read about church history. John Bunyan, born in 1628, died in 1688, 60 years of age. He's buried, very prominent burial place called Bunhill Fields in London. If you ever go to London, it's one of the great places to go. It's on City Road, right opposite John Wesley's house. John Wesley would look out his house and he'd see John Bunyan's grave. And 10,000 Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists buried in Bunhill Fields. There's about 1,000 graves that are visible today. And he was a remarkable preacher. He typifies what is one of the glories of Baptist life, which is the fact that God can take a man who's a shoemaker, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, remember that hymn or that rhyme, and make him a preacher. And I'm big on theological education. I'm going to talk about that this week a little bit. But also I've recognized that sometimes God raises up men who've not had the opportunity for theological education. And Bunyan was such a man. He was what we call a tinker. He used to go door to door mending pots and pans and sharpening knives. We used to live in Westdale in Ontario, Hamilton, Ontario, and there used to be a guy came around the summer in a little van, and you ring a bell, and it wasn't ice cream. I guess he's a tinker. I guess that word means something else now, I think. But he would, if you got out in time, he'd sharpen your knives and whatever, and that's what Bunyan did. And then God saved him and called him to preach. This is Bunyan speaking in the 1650s. My great desire in fulfilling my ministry was to get into the darkest places in the country, among people who are farthest off a profession of Christianity. Not because I could not endure the light, for I feared not to show my gospel to any, but because I found my spirit leaned most after awakening and converting work. And the word I carried did lean that way itself also. Yes, I have so striven to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. It pleased me nothing to see people drink in opinions if they seemed ignorant of Jesus Christ and the worth of their own salvation and sound conviction of sin and a heart set on fire to be saved by Christ. In other words, his great passion in life was to go into places of England and he lived in Bedfordshire, and where little villages where the gospel wasn't being preached. Yeah, there was an Anglican church, but it was dead. The minister was dead as a doornail or whatever, however that expression is. I was going to say dead as a dormouse, but I don't think that's the expression. Dead as a doornail, dead as a dodo, whatever. And Bunyan would preach. If you go to Bedford, I've been to Bedford and kind of done the Bunyan circuit, where Bunyan preached and so on. People will show you, look at that barn. Yeah, that's a 17th century barn. Bunyan preached in that. Or that tree. Bunyan preached under it. Who knows whether he did or not. There's no markers there now, but he preached wherever he could get an audience. And he typified the Baptist in that period. And then in 1689, there was a coup d'etat in England. A Dutchman, William of Orange, became the King of England, came to William III, and he gave religious toleration. And the Baptists now could legally build their own churches. And you'd think, they'll continue to flourish. Well, they don't. Religious freedom, which is a very precious jewel. The men and women we're going to talk about this week, this is not a subject, it's another side story. The freedom we have to gather like this. You couldn't do this in Saudi Arabia. You couldn't do this in Iran. You couldn't do this in China. There are parts of India you couldn't do this. There's vast stretches of this world where we couldn't do and we just take it for granted, don't we? None of you who came this morning thought that there might be police coming from Huntsville, OPP, to arrest us. In fact, the OPP come here, right? Do their whatever they do in the months of May and June. They don't come here to arrest us, thank God. And that's a precious jewel to have religious freedom. But religious freedom is not always conducive to spiritual vitality. And so it proved in this period. And the Baptists begin to decline. By 1689, at the end of the period of persecution, just before William of Orange becomes the King of England, the Baptists had grown to 300 churches in England, Wales, and Ireland. Scotland, with its strong Presbyterian soil, proved impervious to the Baptist plant. And for some reason, the Baptists could really never plant churches in Scotland, and it wouldn't be until the 19th century. That's another story, which we're not going to get into. And 300 churches, 7 churches, 1644, 1660, 130, 1689, around 300. 1715, after 25 years of toleration, 220. 1750, 150. In 100 years, from 1660, when they had 130, to 1750, when they had 150, they've virtually gone nowhere. They've fallen back. In fact, they've gone into a period of decline and stagnation. Why would this happen? There are a number of reasons. Some of them political, some of them geographical. One of them we'll talk about on Thursday, and that is theological. A number of Baptist ministers had become hyper-Calvinists. And that's a word, hyper-Calvinism, that I think is misunderstood. Calvinism is not hyper-Calvinism. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to leave most of that to Thursday. These men, pastors, had come to the conviction, a right conviction, that God saves sinners, right? Salvation is God's great work. But they had moved from that to the idea that if God saves sinners, he's going to save his elect. Maybe if I offer the gospel, let's say this is a church morning congregation, and I offer the gospel to some of you, and some of you, God forbid, are not among the elect, I'm offering you something God's got no intention to give you. You can see this reasoning. It's bonkers, actually. So, just in case I offer you something and encourage you to think you could be saved and God's got no intention of saving you, well, I'm not going to offer it. He's going to save his elect whatever, right? The elect will be saved, and the rest, well, God will send them to hell. And so men and women grew up in churches where nobody pressed on them, nobody pled with them, nobody wept that they come to Christ. We won't get into this either. It'd make a fascinating study to look at the history of crying in public. I'm interested in all kinds of odd things. I'm a historian. And I have a number of PhD students, and they have to get topics, right, to do their PhD theses. And I think my spiritual gift is giving topics. I do. I've got all kinds of topics to write about. And one of them will be the history of weeping. And something happens between the 1700s and the 20th century where men don't weep in public. If George Whitefield came to preach in Ontario, he would weep. Something happens in that period of the Victorian period. I like the Victorians, but some things I don't like about them. And one of them is the idea of what masculinity means. Men don't cry. And that's lost. But some of these Baptist preachers then in the 18th century, they came to the conviction, God will save his elect. I can't do God's work. In fact, I can't try to convince people who aren't going to be saved that they should be saved because God's not going to save them. I'll just announce the facts. Jesus died for sinners. Rather than pleading with men. I'm not a preacher. At least I don't think I am. But I think preaching is difficult. Because one of the things you have to do, you not only have to convey information, you also have to seek to win affections. You have to make the beauty of God so tangible that men and women long to be Christians. And so the Baptists begin to decline because of what we call hyper-Calvinism. Now, they're in decline. We're going to talk we're going to talk more about that this week and how God brings revival. But English society is also in decline. Politically, socially, morally. And one of the key reasons is they kicked out 2,000 ministers. Can you imagine? 2,000 churches on August the 31st, August the 24th is a Sunday, 1662. These men finished their ministry. The following Sunday, who's going to preach in the pulpit? You got 2,000 churches. They don't have anybody to preach in the pulpit. And some of them wouldn't have anybody to preach in the pulpit for the next 50 years. And they would have to have people to come from, they'd have a morning service here, and then the same minister would come, and then he'd go to another church. There are a number of Anglican ministers in this province who have 4 or 5-point charges. Well, that becomes the norm in the Church of England in the 18th century. And no wonder the churches begin to decline. And when Christianity declines in a nation, the nation begins to rot. Christians are salt and light, right? I don't know why any government, that's why our government needs to know history. I don't know how often our Prime Minister reads history. He needs to read history. He needs to read the history of Canada and the history of Western culture and the history of the West since the Reformation and see all the good things that Christianity has done. Otherwise, you wouldn't be passing stupid things like, we're not going to give any money to Christian charities like he did a couple of summers ago, and he withdrew that. Our politicians would want Christians. I mean, who wouldn't want men and women who love to do good works, right? And when Christianity begins to decline, society begins to decline. Here's one Baptist minister, 1701, and if he changed a bit of the language, he could be talking about Toronto. He's talking about London. Was ever sodomy so common in a Christian nation are so notoriously and frequently committed as by too palpable evidence as it appears to be in and about this city, notwithstanding the clear light of the gospel which shines therein, and the great pains taken to reform the abominable profaneness that abounds. Is it not a wonder the patience of God has not consumed us in his wrath before this time? Was ever swearing, blasphemy, whoring, drunkenness, gluttony, self-love, covetousness at such a height as this time here? That's London, 1701. After 40 years of the Puritan ministers no longer being able to conduct their ministry, what you've got is significant moral decline. The 18th century was a century of deep sexual immorality. The Duke of Devonshire, for instance, one of the ancestors of Princess Diana, after a couple of years, he got fed up with his wife. Decided to have his mistress move into the house. And basically, she had to lump it. George I, King of England from 1714 to 1727. He was German, Hanoverian, couldn't speak a word of English. He was the closest relative to the previous monarch, Queen Anne. When she died without children, they went over to Germany. He was his closest relative. He becomes the King of England. He was thrilled to bits to become King of England. Couldn't speak a word of English. Not sure how much English he ever did learn. He had 3 passions in life: food, women, and horses. And depending on the mood, the order would change. He turns up in England. The reason why he was thrilled to become a King of England, well, he's now a king. He's not some little Duke of Hanover. But also, he could solve the problem of his wife. He had 2 mistresses, and then his wife. So he told his wife, why don't you stay here in Hanover, run things in Hanover, and we'll see you later. And off he goes to England. He has 2 big palaces built for one mistress, and for the other. And he'd kind of go back and forth between them. I mean, we look at some of the goings-on of the monarchy today, and I thank God for the queen we've had. What a queen. But some of her children have been anything but. But anyway, nothing new. The Prime Minister of England, the recent Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's not been a model of moral integrity either. Well, the first Prime Minister, the first man who could be called Prime Minister, there are debates about this. There was a man named Robert Harley, after whom Harley Street is named, who was a very godly man. He probably is the first Prime Minister, in my opinion, but the man who normally is the first Prime Minister is Robert Walpole, 1722 to 1742. He was in office for 20 years. He lived in undisguised adultery with his mistress, Molly Scarrett. Now, at least when his wife died, he married her. And what the upper class did, the lower classes did in abundance. They followed suit. You could buy guidebooks in London to brothels. I have no idea whether this is available online. I don't want to know. But it may well be. You could actually buy guidebooks that would give you details of streets where brothels were and the women in them, and details which we don't need to go into. Where does pornography come from? 18th century. There may well have been pornographic literature before then, but it's the 18th century multiplies. There are books in the 18th century that were published. They were banned by the Victorians, and the ban on them didn't get lifted to the 1960s. These are books written in the 18th century. They are so salacious and insidious in terms of what they depict that there is a moral ban on publishing them in England all the way to the 1960s. There's massive moral decline. Most people, this is also the period of the Industrial Revolution. When England is the first nation to go through the Industrial Revolution. We live in a post-industrial society. There are nations today that are in the process of going through the Industrial Revolution. Parts of China are going through the Industrial Revolution. And we're the beneficiaries of that. We have no idea what it cost in human suffering. I grew up in Birmingham. I was born on St. Andrew Street. Don't expect any of you to know where that is. It was a slum, row housing, built in the 19th century. Not a blade of grass. I don't remember seeing grass as a little boy growing up. Your front door walked right onto the street. Your back alley, no grass. And somebody thought it was a brilliant idea to build rows of these houses, not a blade of grass to be seen, no trees, nothing to feed the human spirit about the beauty of creation. At the end of the road, a factory belching out smoke 24/7. And Birmingham, where I grew up, was built in the Industrial Revolution, like Manchester and Leeds. These towns that mushroomed. Men and women came into them looking for jobs. But the urban structure, the urban infrastructure couldn't keep up with the influx of population. And so sometimes you had 4 or 5 families living in one room, no furniture, sleeping on straw. The men having to work 12, 14-hour days. No child labor laws. I see some children here today. You'd all be working in factories if you were living in this world. Most of the men, a good number of the men that we're going to talk about, William Carey, Andrew Fuller, they left school at 10 or 11, and at that point, they were adults. They were in the working world. And this is true, by the way, down to the 20th century. My father-in-law left school at 13. He was in a factory. It was the war years. There's no such thing as teenagers in this world. You know, the years when you can have leisure. You might not think you've got leisure, but you do, compared to later life when you can go to school. That doesn't exist, only for the wealthy. And it's a desperate environment. How do people deal with that? There's very few churches in these inner cities. We'll see the Anglican Church didn't want to go into the inner cities. What Anglican minister would? You're in a little parish out in the countryside, right? My favorite area of England is the Cotswolds. I was born in the very northern part of it. These little villages, they're absolutely stunning. You know, little rivers running through them, little sheep on the hillside, coffee houses or cafes and tea shops and cobblestones, and they're gorgeous. What Anglican minister in his right mind is going to leave that to go into the hell of urban culture? These industrial cities with their smog and their filth and their noise and their disease. Urban cities were cities of disease, typhus, cholera, diphtheria. They didn't. City of Leeds, 8,000 people in 1700. By the end of the century, it's well over 200,000. In 1700, how many Anglican churches in that city serving it? 1. Well, it's a little city, right? Little town, 8,000. It becomes a major industrial center. How many Anglican churches in 1800? 1. There's no vision in the Anglican church to reach the poor. Who will reach the poor? It'll be evangelicals that God raises up in revival. Men like the Wesley brothers who loved the poor. Who every time they went into those inner cities, I didn't realize any of this. I taught this for about 30 years. It was only with the advent of the COVID that I began to research the history of plagues and the history of epidemics in Western culture, that I began to realize that these inner cities were centers of disease and plague, and the wealthy kept their distance from the poor. They looked at the bodies of the poor as bodies ridden with disease. And then I realized the Wesleys and Whitfield went into these places to preach the gospel. They did so at the risk of their lives, obviously, right? How did people deal with that? Well, they had a number of ways. Sexual immorality. Many of these people are all on church. The only thing they know about Jesus is a swear word. They had resort to all kinds of sexual immorality, from adultery all the way over to bestiality. It's vile. It's really vile. Or drink. These people had had opiates and opioids. They would have been into them. They didn't have them. But they had gin. Up until the 18th century, there were two main drinks. By the way, there aren't any things like Pepsis, colas, soft drinks, and all the juices we've got. You basically got water, not safe to drink. You've got milk, not safe to drink. Beer and wine. It's often funny, at least from one vantage point. I don't imbibe alcohol, but I find it funny sometimes when you're reading the minute books of Baptist churches, and at the end of the year they'll have a list of expenses, and they'll have a line item, beer, 10 pounds. Because whenever they had a social function, the church would supply the beer. And I'm not we have our own differences on this. I'm not recommending going out and having a beer, but that's it according to your own conscience, whatever. But in those days, there were beer and wine. But someone in the 18th century invents a thing called gin. And I should have done my reading before I got into this. I've got a book on the history of gin. Because I wanted to find out, I've got no idea what gin is made of, by the way. Is it berries of some sort? What's it? Juniper berries, okay. There was an area of London that's been mapped, 2,000 houses, right? And by a number of ways of determination, it's been figured out that 500 of those houses had a gin shop. People have figured out they could make money. I'd make my still in the back of my house, put a couple of chairs outside at a table, and I could make some money selling gin. You can imagine what this would do to people. What kind of quality. There's no quality control. One writer, Henry Fielding, 1 million people lived in London, largest city in the world in the 18th century. He estimated that about 40 to 50,000 people, their main sustenance was gin. Even if he's wrong, it's horrifying. Here's one. This is a newspaper report from 1748. A couple went to have their child baptized as a baby. They came home and they gave the baby to the nurse. She'd been at home supposedly preparing lunch or dinner. She'd been drinking gin. She was stone drunk. This is a newspaper report. Think about what this really means. At a christening in Beddington, Surrey, the nurse was so intoxicated that after she had undressed the child, instead of laying it in the cradle, she put it behind a large fire where it burned to death in a few minutes. She must have been quite stoned out of her head. But just think of the horror. You've taken your little baby to get baptized, and that would be a big event. And then you bring her home, and you're having a little gathering, and you give the baby to the nurse to take upstairs or wherever, and the baby is burned to death because of her intoxication. Alcohol is a killer. And that's in drunkenness and what it can do to men and women and the ruination of lives. Now, in the middle of this, all of this, it's a mess. I could go on and on. God brings revival in the 1730s. He doesn't bring it to the children of the Puritans. These godly men and women praying that God would do something, and God acts. And where does he act? He acts in the Anglican Church. I hope you're praying for revival. I really do. If not before coming to this week, I hope at the end of this week you'll see that the revival is one of the great needs that you have. It was Martin Lloyd-Jones said this: "There is no subject of greater importance to the Christian church in the 20th century than that of revival. It should be the theme of our constant meditation, preaching, and prayers." I hope that is the case. But just think of if God does bring revival, that he brings it in the united church. What would you do? I have to add one factor. The united church would have to have been persecuting us, which it hasn't been. And I mean no offense to the united church, but the united church in the 1960s began wholesale apostasy. A church that has no idea what to do with a minister in Toronto, Greta Vosper, who is an atheist and doesn't know how to discipline her, is a church from which God has taken away its lampstand. I don't speak lightly. But just think, what would we... There's no way God would revive the United Church. Like really? I taught some classes at Emmanuel College down in the University of Toronto, the United Church training ground for United ministers. One of the big scandals, at least for many of us in Toronto at the time, was when they brought the crucified woman into the back garden of the church, a depiction of a sculpture of a crucified woman. And that's what we're dealing with. But if God brought revival, what would you think? And especially if this church had been persecuting you. But this is what God does. In the answer to the prayers of the Puritans, of the children of the Puritans, of the grandchildren of the Puritans, he brings revival to the Anglicans. He saves George Whitefield in 1735, Easter. And within 2 years, he's preaching to 10,000 people sometimes in London. Or he saves Howell Harris. You may not have heard the name. One of the great Welsh evangelicals. He was a womanizer in his little village of Talgarth. Probably had seduced half the women in his village. He goes to church one Sunday in the spring of 1735. He hears the minister, a man named Price, say, "If you are not fit to come to the Lord's Supper, you're not fit to live or die." It goes deep into his heart. Within 6 weeks, he's been converted. He goes through the village, door after door, asking forgiveness for his sins. Can you imagine that? And once he's gone through his whole village, he shares what God has done for him. He goes to the next village, and then the next village. He's a school teacher. He's getting up at 4 a.m. Sometimes he's getting home at 12 at midnight because he's walking. Finally, the owners of the school said to him, "Look, are you a school teacher or a preacher? You got to choose." He chooses to be a preacher. And for the next 12 years, he preaches all over South Wales to huge crowds. Or Daniel Rowland, also a Welsh preacher, one of those great Welsh towns that begins with a double L, Llangollen. He was an Anglican minister. Had no interest in the gospel. His father had been a minister. His uncles were ministers. One of his brothers was a minister. It gave him a great living. All he had to do was turn up on Sunday, read a little bit out of the Book of Common Prayer. The rest of the week was his. It's brilliant. Sometimes you have to bury somebody and marry somebody, but just think of it. It's a great job. Got a free house, the man's. Somehow he invited a man named Griffith Jones to preach. Griffith Jones knew the character of Daniel Rowland, and he came into the pulpit, and as he prayed that morning, "Lord, convert the minister of this church." Just think you're sitting in the congregation, you hear that. "Lord, convert the minister of this church. Make him a flaming fire in Wales." And he was converted. He's probably a greater preacher than Howell Harris. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a Welshman, said he was the greatest preacher God gave Wales in the 18th century. Or William Grimshaw of Haworth, a man who didn't even believe in the Christian gospel, gets ordained, again, because it gives him a good job, steady income, place to live. Spent most of his week drinking. He had a bit of a conscience. He wouldn't stagger home drunk through the town where he was the minister. He'd sleep it off wherever he was. A couple come to him, whose name were Sutcliffes. They'd been wanting to have a child for many years. Finally, they had a child. But 6 weeks after the birth of their girl, she dies in a crib death. They come to him seeking solace and comfort. "Just go out and have a good time," he says. "No big deal. That's what I do. Go and have a few drinks. It'll pass. 6 weeks later, it hadn't passed. They come back and tell him. For the first time in his life, he's stricken with remorse. He realizes, I'm a preacher. I should be able to help them, and he can't help them. And he begins to get serious about the Christian life, but he doesn't have any idea what to do. He doesn't know what to read. He's a minister, doesn't know where to go. He gets a ledger book like he would draw up for bank accounts, and one side on the credit column, he puts all the good deeds he does in a week, and on the debit column, he does all his sins. At the end of the week, he adds them up. He just hopes at the end of his life it'll balance. One day he's preaching, and he stops in the middle of preaching, and he says this, "We're all going to hell, every one of us, and I've got no idea how to get out of it." What would you do if you had a minister like that? If you don't know, how are we going to know? But in God's mercy, a man named Benjamin Ingham, one of the friends of the Wesleys, would preach in the area, and he came to him, and he said to Grimshaw, you're really like a Pharisee. You're trying to work your way to heaven. You need to flee to Christ and plead his blood and righteousness. And in the providence of God, he's saved. He moves churches. He goes to a place called St. Michael and All Angels. And I've been there. In Haworth. Haworth, you might know Haworth. That's where the Bronte sisters lived. I like Jane Austen. I don't care for the Brontes. Kind of bleak. You know, Charlotte, is it Charlotte Gray or Jane Eyre? And all of their novels I know are brilliant, but it's kind of bleak. It's a very bleak area of England. It's the West Riding of Yorkshire. Very steep and hilly. In Grimshaw, first Sunday he's there's 12 people in a church that can seat 1,000. Within 5 years, there are 6,000. 6,000 come to the church. Church is filled to capacity. When they have the Lord's Supper, it takes them 4 hours. 4 hours to do the Lord's Supper. Where are all the people? They're all in the cemetery around. Just a remarkable preacher of the gospel. God begins to save men throughout Britain like this. I could go on. Thomas Scott. John Newton. William Cooper. Henry Venn. Just remarkable group of ministers. But they're all Anglicans. And the Baptists are looking at them. This can't really be of God. The Wesleys, well, they're Arminian. Right? You know, they believe that man has some free will, and we won't get into all that, but there's no way they're right. They're wrong. So we're not listening to the Wesleys. George Whitefield, when he preached, well, he says he's a Calvinist, but man, he sure sounds like an Arminian. He's pleading with sinners. He's weeping over them. And that ain't going to do any good. If God hasn't elected him, it won't do him an ounce of good. He's got an Arminian accent. And meanwhile, the Baptists are going from bad to worse in decline. Andrew Fuller, who God would use greatly, said, if God had not stepped in for us, we would be little better than a dunghill in society. He was a farmer by background. Well, this week we will find out how God stopped this community from being a dunghill and used them greatly. And as I said, my great goal at the end of the week is to give you a hunger for God to move in revival. Whatever, in terms of comparison of 20th century Ontario and 18th century England, are we worse, are we better? We're pretty bad off. And our only hope is God. And at the end of the week, I thought that's what I want you to come away with. I want you to learn some history along the way too and get interested in history and Christian biography. But oh, that God would give each of you a hunger for revival. And it would fill your prayers. And if you're a preacher of the gospel, it would fill your preaching, as Martin Lloyd Jones said. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this day, for the day in which you have caused us to live. a day of great opportunity. Oh, that you would give us eyes to see that the fields are white unto harvest, that you would indeed in our day pour out your Spirit afresh, that we might learn from the past, that it might not simply be stories of a bygone era that tickle our ears, but thrill the soul and inspire the heart to action. Bless this day, the rest of this week, for Jesus' sake. Amen.